Unbelievable! Lewis Hamilton is officially returning to Mercedes, and the entire Formula One world is in absolute shock. No one saw this coming. What led to this jaw-dropping move? What does it mean for Ferrari, and for the future of F1 itself? This isn't just a transfer, it's a global earthquake. The news is already going viral, and the implications are massive. Stay with us until the very end, because what we're about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about Lewis Hamilton, Mercedes, and the 2026 season. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Lewis Hamilton's stunning return to Mercedes has unleashed a tidal wave of emotion, speculation, and controversy across the Formula One world, upending assumptions and reigniting one of the sport's most iconic alliances. What was once dismissed as gossip whispered in the shadows has now erupted into a full-blown reality, one that is already sending aftershocks through every corner of the paddock. This isn't just a driver switch, it's a dramatic unraveling of trust, ambition, and identity. The seven-time world champion, who once made headlines by leaving Mercedes to join Ferrari in what was hailed as the most monumental move of his career, has now reversed course. His decision is not born from nostalgia or sentimentality. It stems from something much deeper: disillusionment, frustration, and a growing sense that the red suit he put on never truly fit him. From the moment Hamilton walked through the gates at Maranello, the dream began to flicker. Outwardly, everything appeared perfect: the grand unveiling, the photo ops, the official statements laced with optimism. But behind the scenes, the energy was off. Even in the earliest simulations, Hamilton noticed a rigidity in how decisions were made. His feedback, though welcomed in theory, rarely made its way into actionable changes. Ferrari, a team cloaked in history, seemed unwilling to adapt its processes for a newcomer, even one of Hamilton's caliber. There was an invisible wall, a deeply ingrained hierarchy that Hamilton couldn't penetrate. The culture was different, steeped in tradition but resistant to transformation, more focused on protecting the Ferrari way than embracing outside innovation. As the season kicked off, the tension began to build. Hamilton quickly observed a pattern that disturbed him. Every time new updates were rolled out, whether aerodynamic tweaks, revised floor designs, or experimental suspension elements, they always found their way to Charles Leclerc's car first. Initially, the reasoning made sense. Ferrari claimed it was a matter of data gathering, that Leclerc's familiarity with the car made him the ideal test bed. But over time, the explanations grew thinner. Hamilton began to notice that even when updates worked well for Leclerc, they were slow to reach his side of the garage, if they arrived at all. His engineers would reassure him the parts were coming, only for the deadlines to shift. He would watch, race after race, as Leclerc was equipped with tools that never quite made it to his hands. The message was subtle but unmissable: he was not the priority. In internal debriefs, the problem became even clearer. Hamilton would raise concerns about corner entry instability, rear degradation, or power deployment inconsistencies, but the focus would always shift to Leclerc's data. Technical directors and race engineers seemed calibrated around one voice, and it wasn't his. He began to feel like a guest in someone else's house, present but never quite integrated. Every conversation became a careful dance, every suggestion he offered filtered through layers of protocol and bureaucracy. The once vibrant driver who thrived on transparency and collaboration was slowly being boxed into silence. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. His relationship with Frédéric Vasseur, Ferrari's team principal, became increasingly strained. At first, their dynamic was polite, even hopeful. But as the races wore on and Hamilton's concerns mounted, Vasseur's responses became evasive, often layered in corporate doublespeak. Meetings turned colder, shorter, more scripted. Hamilton, who had become accustomed to Toto Wolff's straightforward style and open-door approach, struggled with Vasseur's diplomatic vagueness. Decisions that affected his entire race weekend, tire strategy, pit windows, fuel mapping, were made without his full input or sometimes without his knowledge. He wasn't being treated like a seven-time champion. He was being handled like an accessory. Meanwhile, the distance between Hamilton and Leclerc widened. Though they were never openly hostile, their camaraderie was brittle. Leclerc had spent years nurturing deep bonds within Ferrari's walls, building trust with every layer of the organization. He was the face of the team, the long-term investment, the Prince of Maranello. Hamilton was the outsider, the mercenary with a record but no roots. Their interactions remained professional, but behind the scenes, there was unease. Engineers tended to defer to Leclerc's preferences. Strategy calls often favored his needs. In moments of uncertainty, the team leaned toward the driver they knew best. It wasn't personal, it was institutional. Hamilton's frustrations grew impossible to contain. He began voicing his concerns more forcefully, questioning decisions in post-race debriefs, challenging the logic behind pit stop timing and tire compound choices. His tone grew sharper, his patience thinner. During one particularly heated race weekend, after a late strategy call cost him a podium, Hamilton reportedly confronted senior members of the technical staff behind closed doors. He demanded clarity, accountability, and fairness. The room went silent. Nothing changed. That moment became a turning point, a realization that no matter how loudly he spoke, the walls around him weren't listening. Even his most ardent supporters within Ferrari began to express concern. Whispers emerged about Hamilton being difficult, too demanding, or out of sync with Ferrari's ethos. The narrative began to shift. What had once been excitement about a legendary driver joining the prancing horse turned into questions about whether he had ever truly belonged. And that question gnawed at Hamilton more than anything else. Because he didn't come to Ferrari for money or fame, he had all that already. He came for legacy. He came to write a new chapter. But instead, he found himself trapped in someone else's story. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. That's when the first quiet conversations with Mercedes began. Nothing official. Nothing concrete. Just old allies reaching out. A casual text. A phone call after a disappointing race. A whisper of what might be possible if he came home. The more disconnected he felt at Ferrari, the more those conversations started to feel like lifelines. He remembered what it felt like to be trusted, to walk into a garage where his words carried weight, where innovation wasn't feared but pursued. At Mercedes, he had always been more than a driver. He had been a partner, a co-architect of success. And now, after months of being sidelined and second-guessed, that idea became irresistible. Returning to Mercedes wasn't just a career move, it was a reclamation. It was Hamilton choosing to prioritize authenticity over optics, alignment over politics, purpose over nostalgia. It was a bold, defiant answer to a year of being diminished and disregarded. And in doing so, he didn't just walk away from Ferrari. He issued a challenge to the entire paddock. Never underestimate what he can still achieve when he's in an environment that believes in him. The coming season will be more than a return. It will be a reckoning. What was initially presented as a simple, perhaps even routine, logistical adjustment within Ferrari's high-stakes Formula One operation has since unraveled into a deepening internal conflict. One that now threatens to destabilize not only the relationship between its two star drivers, but also the very foundations of trust that Ferrari leadership had so carefully tried to construct. The controversy centers around a meticulously developed aerodynamic upgrade, an advanced package including revised floor dynamics, an updated rear wing, and subtle but significant changes to airflow management across the body of the car. This wasn't an afterthought or a minor tweak. It had been in the pipeline for weeks, maybe months. It had gone through simulations, wind tunnel calibrations, and lengthy strategy meetings. And Lewis Hamilton, by all accounts, had been part of those meetings from the very beginning. Not only had he been consulted, but he had been reassured, more than once, that this upgrade, when ready, would be implemented simultaneously on both cars, maintaining the principle of absolute equality between himself and Charles Leclerc. That principle wasn't merely a nice gesture, it was essential. For Hamilton, it was foundational. He left Mercedes not just for the red suit and the legacy of Maranello, but because he was promised a project where he would be seen, heard, and treated as an equal force, not as an afterthought. He had made it clear from the moment negotiations began that parity between drivers was not negotiable. It was enshrined in every discussion, reiterated in contractual terms, and repeated often enough by Frederick Vasseur that Hamilton believed it. He trusted it. He took a leap of faith based on those words, believing that Ferrari was offering him a clean slate, a true partnership, a new chapter where he could fight for wins, and maybe even titles, on a level playing field. But when race day arrived and the highly anticipated upgrade appeared only on Leclerc's car, that trust began to crack. Ferrari's internal explanation was swift and carefully crafted. There were production delays, only one version of the component was ready, and Hamilton would receive the identical spec by the following Grand Prix. That was the official line. But for Hamilton, none of it rang true. He didn't buy it, not entirely. To him, this wasn't just about a part being late, it felt calculated. It felt like a quiet message, A subtle shift in priorities, an early declaration of where Ferrari's internal support truly lay. The timing, the execution, the delivery. All of it suggested, at least in his eyes, that Leclerc's campaign was being fast-tracked while his own was being put on hold. People within Hamilton's circle described him as stunned, then furious. He reportedly felt as if he had been deceived, not through direct lies, but through broken promises masked as operational necessity. What made it worse was the setting. The Spanish Grand Prix was no small venue. It was an essential litmus test for mid-season performance, a track where aerodynamic efficiency could mean the difference between dominance and mediocrity. To be sidelined, technically and emotionally, at such a critical juncture was, to Hamilton, unforgivable. This wasn't a case of mechanical failure or bad luck. This was a conscious choice made by someone, somewhere within Ferrari's upper ranks. Following the race, behind the paddock's polished facade, a confrontation erupted. It didn't happen on the pit wall or through intermediaries. Hamilton went straight to Vasseur. Inside Ferrari's private hospitality suite, surrounded by closed doors and silent walls, a face-to-face clash took place, an emotional, highly charged exchange that, according to those nearby, was intense enough to silence nearby conversations and draw glances from neighboring teams. Hamilton reportedly didn't hold back. He called out the breach of trust. He reminded Vasseur of the numerous times they had sat across from each other, discussing fairness, equal machinery, mutual ambition. He accused the team boss of going back on his word, not because of circumstance, but because of choice. Vasseur, known for his calm demeanor and strategic diplomacy, attempted to explain. He stuck to the team's script, repeating that the situation was temporary, that production delays were real, and that the team remained committed to fairness across the season. But for Hamilton, the moment had already passed. The damage wasn't in the car, it was in the message. He didn't feel like a co-leader in a dual-driver campaign anymore. He felt like a secondary asset, a symbol of prestige perhaps, but not the focal point of Ferrari's strategic vision. That realization cut deeper than any technical deficit. In the aftermath, the ripples spread quickly. Engineers, mechanics, and support staff, many of whom had worked with Hamilton for years, felt the shift in atmosphere. Tensions that had previously simmered under the surface now hovered in every briefing. Team morale splintered into unspoken camps. Some staffers began questioning leadership decisions. Others quietly defended the team's timeline and production challenges. Meanwhile, external observers in the paddock began to notice. Media rumors gained traction. Sponsors started making quiet calls for clarification. And Leclerc, who had done nothing overtly wrong, found himself in the awkward position of beneficiary, consciously or not, of a decision that may have tilted the balance of the season. For Hamilton, this wasn't about paranoia. It was about patterns. It was about what happens when subtle decisions add up to shape a narrative, one that favors one driver's rhythm over another's. He wasn't asking for favors. He was demanding what he had been promised, a shot at victory on equal terms, free from internal politics, free from favoritism cloaked as pragmatism. In his mind, if a top team begins to show signs of partiality this early in the season, it's not a fluke, it's a warning. As the calendar marches forward, the wounds from that weekend remain raw. Ferrari may issue upgrades. They may match specifications. They may publicly reaffirm their commitment to equality. But behind closed doors, a shift has occurred. Hamilton has seen behind the curtain. And once that happens, trust isn't something you rebuild with words or even with parts. It's something that takes time, consistency, and absolute clarity to earn back. Whether Ferrari understands that remains to be seen. Whether they can repair what was broken in Spain may determine not only the outcome of the championship, but the fate of their relationship with one of the most iconic figures in the history of the sport. From the outside, the alliance between Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari was hailed as a monumental turning point in Formula One history, a seismic shift that promised to unite the sport's most decorated driver with its most iconic team. For many, it was seen as the final chapter of a legendary career, the storybook move that would lead Hamilton to etch his name into Ferrari's legacy with the same indelible ink he used at Mercedes. But beneath the glimmer of red overalls and carefully choreographed press conferences, the truth was far messier, more volatile, and ultimately far more tragic than anyone could have anticipated. What began as a hopeful project built on mutual admiration quickly deteriorated into a slow-motion collision of values, expectations, and cultures, one that now threatens to end in heartbreak, resentment, and possibly an early and unceremonious departure. Multiple insiders, from both within the Ferrari organization and Hamilton's own circle, have begun painting a picture of dysfunction and disillusionment. Far from a harmonious environment that had been sold during initial negotiations, Hamilton discovered a system mired in outdated traditions, unspoken hierarchies, and decision-making processes that seemed to favor preservation over progression. From the very first months, there were subtle signals, moments in briefings where his feedback was acknowledged with courtesy but no follow-through, technical sessions where key decisions had already been finalized without his involvement, and strategy discussions that seemed to orbit around him, rather than include him. He had not come to be a passenger in his final act in Formula One. He had come to lead. But leadership requires access, autonomy, and above all, trust. Three things he increasingly felt were in short supply. Hamilton, known for his meticulous preparation and deep technical engagement, was shocked to discover how little weight his voice carried in Maranello. At Mercedes, his relationship with engineers was one of creative friction and shared problem-solving. He was not just a driver, he was a collaborator, someone who lived in the telemetry data, who understood the car's language, who influenced its evolution. In Italy, the environment was starkly different. There was a reverence for hierarchy that bordered on rigidity. Input had to flow through formal channels. Suggestions required approval. Even the most basic tweaks to setup or tire philosophy would pass through several layers of management before implementation. It created a feedback loop so sluggish that by the time action was taken, the window of competitive advantage had often closed. What frustrated Hamilton most wasn't just the slowness, it was the absence of accountability. When things went wrong, no one seemed to own the outcome. There were endless internal reviews, closed-door meetings, and polished statements, but rarely did he feel there was a direct conversation about cause and effect. Mistakes were buried under bureaucracy. Meanwhile, races were being lost not on track, but on whiteboards, in email threads, and in chain-of-command confusion. It was not just inefficient, it was infuriating. He began to feel like an observer in his own team, someone expected to execute without truly being invited into the architecture of performance. The communication breakdowns extended to race day, where the stakes are highest and clarity is non-negotiable. Radio transmissions from the pit wall became a recurring source of anxiety and mistrust. Hamilton, who built his success on real-time adaptability and quick, clean dialogue with his engineers, was forced to contend with hesitation, contradictions, and ambiguity. Calls to pit came too late. Tire information arrived incomplete. Strategy updates were disjointed. At times, messages would contradict telemetry, leading to situations where Hamilton felt he was being forced to improvise with no safety net. It wasn't a matter of interpretation, it was a collapse of operational discipline. Nowhere was this dysfunction more painfully evident than at the Canadian Grand Prix, a race that will likely serve as a case study for how not to manage a driver of Hamilton's caliber. Heading into the weekend, morale was already strained. Technical directives had been delayed. Setup changes were debated to exhaustion, but executed too late to be meaningful. Then came the race itself, a nightmare scenario unfolding in slow motion. The weather was unpredictable, the track surface unforgiving, and the car's balance inconsistent. Still, Hamilton was in the fight, until a sequence of calamitous pit wall decisions ripped the entire strategy apart. He was told to stay out, then told to box, then told to stay out again. By the time he entered the pits, his tires weren't ready. He lost time. He lost places. He lost control of a weekend that had been salvageable. And when he crossed the finish line, the silence on team radio spoke louder than any words. What followed was an explosion behind the scenes. Sources close to the team report that Hamilton's post-race debrief was one of the most confrontational of his entire career. No PR spin. No careful diplomacy. He accused the strategy team of operational failure. He told senior staff point-blank that their indecision and lack of coordination had cost him not just points, but belief in the project. He directed specific criticism at Fred Vasseur, demanding answers for why his instructions had been disregarded. It was not rage for show, it was a direct, painful articulation of months of growing frustration. And it marked a definitive shift in tone from one of collaboration to confrontation. Beyond that race, the breakdown continued. Relationships that had started with mutual respect began to fray. Conversations became colder, shorter, more formal. Engineers seemed less open. Briefings were more scripted. Hamilton no longer felt part of the mission. He felt managed, controlled, reduced to a component instead of a partner. For someone who had given his life to Formula One, who had elevated team after team through vision, leadership, and sheer will, this reduction was more than professional, it was personal. And it hurt. The deeper tragedy is that Hamilton had joined Ferrari not out of convenience, but conviction. He believed in the mythos of the team, the poetry of closing his career in red. He wanted to win not just titles, but hearts. He wanted to bring back glory to a team whose name still echoes louder than any other in racing lore. But dreams require alignment. And what he found in Maranello was a machine too rigid to bend, too proud to listen, too stuck in the past to follow a new path. As rumors intensify about back-channel talks with rival teams, contractual escape clauses, and closed-door meetings with legal advisors, the sport is beginning to realize that the Hamilton-Ferrari alliance may already be broken beyond repair. Not because the car was too slow, not because the team lacked talent, but because two visions, one built on innovation and agency, the other on tradition and structure, were never truly compatible. And now that incompatibility is playing out in public, one painful race at a time, as the greatest driver of a generation quietly prepares to write an ending that was never supposed to happen this way. Lewis Hamilton had entered the Ferrari chapter of his career with optimism, prestige, and an almost poetic sense of destiny. For years, the thought of the seven-time world champion donning the red overalls of the prancing horse had lived in the imagination of fans and insiders alike. It was supposed to be a legendary union, the sport's most successful driver joining its most iconic team in pursuit of rewriting history. But as the months unfolded, the honeymoon phase crumbled under the weight of unmet expectations, poor execution, and an internal structure that felt more like a monument to the past than a platform for future dominance. What Hamilton discovered was not the collaborative powerhouse he envisioned, but a labyrinth of traditions, outdated processes, and conflicting interests where decisive leadership was constantly diluted by committee-based inertia. Behind the scenes, the situation deteriorated faster than most realized. Ferrari's promises, technical upgrades, influence on development, integration into decision-making, started to fade into vagueness. Race weekends were marked by confusion, strategic blunders, and a growing disconnect between what was discussed in private meetings and what actually occurred on track. There were moments Hamilton found himself fighting not just the car, but the very organization around him. He often returned to the garage with feedback he knew wouldn't be acted upon, watched technical meetings spiral into ego contests, and saw politics outweigh performance in a way that frustrated him deeply. This wasn't what he had left Mercedes for. This wasn't the level of focus, accountability, or hunger he had spent his entire career demanding from those around him. The frustration simmered in silence for a while. Outwardly, Hamilton remained diplomatic, but internally, the man who once led one of the most formidable dynasties in Formula One history was struggling to reconcile where he was versus where he had been. And it was during this emotional turbulence that an old familiar voice re-emerged, not by accident, but through a subtle deliberate series of exchanges that began cautiously and grew more purposeful with time. Toto Wolff, the architect of Mercedes' era of domination and Hamilton's closest ally in the sport, had never completely severed contact. Even after Hamilton's departure, the respect between them remained intact, and what began as brief messages quickly evolved into late-night calls filled with unspoken understanding and carefully worded hypotheticals. Mercedes, meanwhile, was navigating its own crisis of identity. The team had failed to recapture its past glory in Hamilton's absence. Andrea Kimi Antonelli, the young prodigy heralded as the next great talent, had not yet lived up to the hype. His performances were inconsistent, his relationship with George Russell was tepid at best, and the team struggled to create a clear internal hierarchy. Race development became reactive, car evolution felt directionless, and Wolff, despite his strategic brilliance, was visibly frustrated by a garage that no longer functioned with the symphony-like precision he once oversaw. For months, he had watched races unfold with a haunting realization that something fundamental was missing. Not just speed, not just execution, but leadership, soul, vision. When Hamilton began expressing his mounting dissatisfaction privately, Wolff recognized an extraordinary opening. It wasn't about nostalgia. It wasn't even about performance statistics. It was about rebuilding a dynamic that had once felt invincible. In Hamilton, Wolff saw the return of clarity. In Wolff, Hamilton saw the restoration of trust. Together, they began engineering a reunion not born out of desperation, but mutual recognition that their synergy was more than just driver and boss. It was a winning formula rooted in shared values, absolute transparency, and an unrelenting pursuit of excellence. What followed was one of the most secretive and efficient negotiations in modern F1 history. Confidential meetings were arranged at remote, undisclosed locations. Security teams were instructed to shield identities. Travel was conducted through private channels. No email trail existed. Only the tightest circle within both camps was aware of what was happening. They combed through the ruins of the previous contract, identifying pain points, gaps in responsibility, and triggers that had led to the collapse of the Ferrari experiment. Then they constructed a new framework, not simply to sign Hamilton again, but to ensure the second era at Mercedes would be even more transformative than the first. The new terms were built with surgical precision. Hamilton would regain a central role in car development, ensuring his feedback wouldn't just be heard, it would define the engineering roadmap. He would be given access to data pipelines and simulator infrastructure he hadn't touched in years. His race engineers and technical staff would be reshuffled to mirror the cohesion he had once thrived in. Even his personal team, from trainers to strategists, would be given latitude that few drivers in history had ever been granted. For Mercedes, this was not a gamble. It was a calculated reinvestment in a system they knew could work, because it already had. And as the deal neared completion, the energy within both camps shifted. At Mercedes, engineers who had grown weary of transition years suddenly found themselves motivated. Designers began working late again, excited by the idea of tailoring a car to Hamilton's driving DNA. At Brackley, the atmosphere changed. The team wasn't just preparing for another season. They were preparing for redemption. At Ferrari, on the other hand, whispers began to circulate that Hamilton was emotionally checked out. Team leaders held tense meetings trying to reassure staff, but the silence from the man himself spoke louder than any corporate statement ever could. For Hamilton, this was more than a career pivot. It was a homecoming. He never viewed himself as just an employee of Mercedes. He had helped shape the very culture of the team. And the decision to return wasn't made lightly. It was rooted in everything he valued most: unity, purpose, excellence, and the freedom to lead without interference. He missed the camaraderie, the crisp execution, the sense that every single person, from the data analyst to the pit crew, was aligned in service of a singular mission that had been missing for far too long. Now, it would return. The contract was signed in total secrecy, but when news finally broke, leaked through a single source known only to Wolff's inner circle, it sent shockwaves through the sport. Fans were stunned. Media scrambled. Ferrari leadership was blindsided. But to those who truly knew the inner workings of Formula One, the signs had always been there. This wasn't just Hamilton moving teams. This was the reawakening of a machine that had been lying dormant, and now had every reason to roar back to life. In an age of engineered PR stories and manufactured rivalries, this story was real, emotional, strategic, ruthlessly intelligent. It reminded the racing world that the greatest battles aren't always fought on track. Sometimes, they unfold in shadows, shaped by memory, loyalty, and timing. And in that quiet space where legends are rewritten, Lewis Hamilton and Toto Wolff were ready to author the next chapter. Not to relive old glories, but to build something even greater. From the moment Lewis Hamilton signed with Ferrari, there was a sense of history in the making, a seismic shift in the world of Formula One. The seven-time world champion, known for his relentless drive, analytical precision, and transformative influence on any team he joins, was expected to breathe new life into the iconic Italian outfit. Yet behind the scenes, far from the celebratory press releases and choreographed photo ops, a very different reality began to unfold, one defined not by progress and innovation, but by tension, disillusionment, and a widening gap between what had been promised and what was ultimately delivered. As he integrated into Ferrari's day-to-day operations, it became immediately clear that certain elements of his working environment would not reflect the freedoms and influence he had grown accustomed to during his record-breaking years with Mercedes. One of the most immediate and deeply personal disappointments came from Ferrari's refusal to accommodate members of his long-trusted personal team, individuals who had followed him through multiple championship campaigns and who had become instrumental in his race weekend preparation. These were not merely advisors, they were experts in performance metrics, telemetry analysis, and strategic decision-making. At Mercedes, they were embedded in every phase of race execution, helping to decode tire behavior, extract hidden insights from practice data, and simulate various race scenarios based on real-time conditions. With their support, Hamilton had fine-tuned a system that allowed him to operate at the edge of performance, not just as a driver but as a strategic force within the team. Ferrari, however, enforced a long-standing and rigid protocol regarding internal access. The team's leadership, deeply rooted in tradition and internal hierarchy, placed strict limits on who could participate in briefings, strategy sessions, or data reviews. The rationale, from their perspective, was protecting sensitive technical information and maintaining clear chains of authority. But for Hamilton, this wasn't just a logistical inconvenience. It was a fundamental betrayal of what he believed had been agreed upon before his signature went on the contract. The very people he considered part of his competitive foundation were left on the sidelines, excluded from the processes where they could make the most impact. Meetings that once felt collaborative and transparent began to feel constrained and insulated. Even as he sat among engineers and strategists at the heart of Maranello, Hamilton began to feel like an outsider within his own team. But perhaps the most profound and far-reaching breakdown involved the technological infrastructure Hamilton believed he was inheriting, or rather, the lack thereof. One of his key conditions before joining the Scuderia had centered on the promise of an ambitious overhaul of the team's simulator systems. He had been assured, both verbally and in writing, that Ferrari would prioritize upgrading their outdated simulation capabilities to rival those used by Mercedes and Red Bull. This wasn't a peripheral concern. Hamilton viewed the simulator as one of the most vital tools in his arsenal. It allowed him to test car setups virtually, refine race strategies days in advance, and identify weaknesses long before hitting the track. He had spent years helping to co-develop Mercedes simulator technology, shaping it into one of the most advanced in the sport. That tool had given him a critical edge during championship seasons, and he expected nothing less from Ferrari's commitment to future success. What followed, however, was a slow unraveling of that trust. Despite initial meetings and shared visions of technical reinvention, Ferrari's promises began to falter. The simulator project faced repeated internal delays, hampered by bureaucratic red tape, underfunding, and shifting engineering priorities. Rumors began to circulate within the factory that certain departments viewed the upgrades as unnecessary, or worse, as a vanity project tied to Hamilton's arrival rather than a core development necessity. The result was stagnation. The simulator remained years behind its competitors in terms of realism, feedback accuracy, and integration with live data. Hamilton, after enduring several frustrating sessions that yielded conflicting or outright misleading telemetry, eventually made the decision to abandon it entirely. He no longer saw value in practicing with a tool that didn't reflect reality and that compromised rather than sharpened his performance. The absence of a reliable simulator had a domino effect. Race weekends became more reactive, less predictable. The ability to simulate tire degradation, fuel loads, and aerodynamic balance in advance was severely limited. Setup decisions had to be made with less precision, and when things went wrong on track, Hamilton had fewer resources to fall back on. For a driver who thrived on preparation and outsmarting opponents through planning, this technological shortfall felt like racing blindfolded. It didn't just affect results, it chipped away at his confidence in the team's vision. Beyond tools and access, there was an even deeper philosophical rift forming, one that went to the core of how Ferrari operated. Hamilton arrived expecting a seat at the table, not just as a driver but as a collaborator in shaping the team's future. He envisioned a role similar to what he had at Mercedes, part athlete, part strategist, part leader. What he found instead was an organization steeped in tradition, where deference to past success often took precedence over adapting to modern demands. Ideas he proposed, ranging from changes in driver debrief structure to the way race simulations were shared across departments, were acknowledged politely but rarely implemented. Technical concerns were sometimes brushed aside in favor of maintaining long-established procedures. Innovation was constrained by institutional conservatism. Even when he raised concerns about rear instability or the car's behavior under braking, feedback loops were slow and often filtered through layers of approval that dulled the urgency of his input. Morale within Hamilton's camp began to erode. Those close to him described a growing frustration, a sense that he had entered into a partnership with a team unwilling to fully embrace the transformation he had been promised he could help lead. From trackside conversations to internal performance reviews, the disconnect grew more pronounced. Ferrari engineers, many of whom respected Hamilton deeply, were caught in a tug-of-war between their reverence for his talent and their obligation to follow a system that had been in place long before his arrival. The resulting inertia was suffocating. This was never supposed to be just another contract or just another team switch. Hamilton's move to Ferrari had been pitched as a historic merger of legacy and greatness, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to write a new chapter in both their stories. But instead of synergy, there was separation. Instead of evolution, resistance. Instead of empowerment, limitation. The emotional toll this took on Hamilton was immense. He had risked not only his reputation but his legacy, betting that he could bring Ferrari back to the pinnacle of Formula One. He had imagined a renaissance. What he found was a system too entrenched to change. As the season progressed and results failed to match expectations, those cracks became impossible to ignore. Internally, conversations began to shift from how to win together to how long the partnership could realistically last. A driver of Hamilton's caliber does not tolerate mediocrity, and a team of Ferrari's stature does not react well to dissent from within. The relationship, once defined by optimism, now operated under a fragile truce, held together by contractual obligation rather than shared vision. In the paddock, rival teams watched carefully. What had once been viewed as a potential championship-winning alliance had deteriorated into an uneasy standoff. Whispers of tension became louder. Some wondered whether Hamilton would see out his contract. Others speculated about potential exits, buyouts, or quiet negotiations behind the scenes. But for those who knew him best, the heartbreak wasn't in the headlines. It was in the silence. In the absence of the joy, control, and clarity that had defined his best seasons. And for Ferrari, the lesson may come too late. Greatness cannot be bought with prestige alone. It must be nurtured with trust, adaptation, and the courage to let go of the past. Inside Ferrari, the mood had shifted from hopeful to fractured in a matter of months, and the transformation was anything but subtle. What had started as a celebrated partnership between Lewis Hamilton and the legendary Scuderia quickly morphed into a strained coexistence riddled with miscommunication, unspoken tensions, and cultural mismatches that no amount of public diplomacy could hide. From the very beginning, Hamilton had brought with him not only his immense talent but also a vision, a belief that Ferrari could be modernized, streamlined, and reborn as a championship-winning force. However, what he encountered behind closed doors was not the progressive mindset he had anticipated, but a team clinging desperately to tradition, power hierarchies, and internal politics that stifled any real momentum. The core of the problem wasn't just the performance of the car, the aerodynamic inconsistencies, or even the strategic errors on race weekends. Those were symptoms. The real challenge was structural. A rigid system where innovation was viewed with suspicion, and new voices, especially those with outside influence, were met with resistance. Many of the engineers and specialists who had migrated with Hamilton from Mercedes, individuals who had helped shape an era of dominance in the sport, found themselves ignored, isolated, or reassigned to roles far beneath their capabilities. Their ideas were regularly dismissed in meetings. Proposals for procedural change were quietly shelved. Technical suggestions met blank stares or veiled resentment. And as weeks turned into months, morale plummeted. Hamilton, who had always prided himself on being a team player and a unifier, struggled with the realization that his presence was not galvanizing the group but dividing it. He was perceived not as a savior, but as a threat, a reminder of how far Ferrari had fallen behind and how much they would need to adapt to catch up. Conversations with department heads turned increasingly formal and strained. Collaborative problem-solving sessions became political battlegrounds. Trust, the lifeblood of any high-functioning team, eroded with every internal conflict. The once hopeful project now felt like a war of attrition, and Hamilton found himself fighting not just competitors on the track, but a philosophy ingrained in the walls of Maranello itself, one that valued legacy over progress and identity over evolution. Despite the public smiles, the Instagram posts, and the media statements of unity, the fracture was too deep to repair. Hamilton began to see the writing on the wall. Ferrari, for all its history and allure, wasn't ready to change, not in the way that true transformation required. The fire in his chest hadn't dimmed, but it had become increasingly difficult to focus that energy in an environment that resisted the very concept of adaptation. And so, after countless late-night debriefs filled with frustration, long conversations with his closest advisors, and a growing realization that staying might cost him more than just races, he made the decision that sent shockwaves through the paddock. He was going home. The announcement of Hamilton's return to Mercedes wasn't merely breaking news, it was an earthquake. The implications were massive. He wasn't just rejoining a former team, he was reigniting a bond with the one organization that had understood him, elevated him, and trusted him from day one. The driver who had once rewritten the record books in silver and black would once again wear those colors, but this time with more wisdom, more scars, and more motivation than ever before. George Russell, no longer the wide-eyed protege, had grown into a confident and strategic racer in his own right. Their pairing, once considered teacher and student, would now evolve into a high-stakes collaboration defined by mutual respect, competitive fire, and the ever-present possibility of internal rivalry. What Mercedes is getting, however, is not just the same Hamilton who left. They are welcoming back a man transformed by adversity, sharpened by disappointment, and hardened by the emotional toll of a venture that fell far short of its promise. He returns not with bitterness, but with an edge. A driver who has seen how quickly loyalty can evaporate and how fragile even the most powerful brands can be without unity. Mercedes understands this version of Hamilton, maybe even better than he understands himself. And that's why the transition has been seamless. Technical meetings, simulator sessions, and development briefings have already begun. Engineers who once celebrated titles with him are now poring over data, eager to build a machine that will carry not only Hamilton's legacy forward but Mercedes' resurgence as well. This reunion isn't just symbolic, it's strategic. It's emotional. It's a shot across the bow to every rival on the grid who thought the Hamilton era had passed. It's a declaration that heart still matters, that character still counts, and that there's more to Formula One than raw pace and financial might. Hamilton is not simply seeking more trophies. He's hunting for redemption, for legacy cemented not just by numbers but by resilience, grit, and the ability to rise again when the world doubted him most. He won't say it out loud, but every move he makes now is fueled by a quiet defiance. Every practice session, every qualifying lap, every debrief is part of a larger mission to reclaim control over his narrative. He doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, yet he's driven as if he does. This isn't the Lewis Hamilton of a decade ago. This is a man who's been through the fire and come out forged anew. And as the engines roar to life and the lights go out, there will be one name on everyone's mind, not just because of what he's done, but because of what he still intends to do.